fabulous panel lined up for you this morning. I'm so delighted to have these writers here sharing their knowledge and experience with you today. So let me introduce you to them, starting with Ben Aitken, who is the author of A Chip Shop in Poznan and My Unlikely Year in Poland. I was hoping it was my, a year, but it's My Unlikely Year in Poland, which recounts a year spent in Poland, working, traveling, and integrating. Paul Ross called it the funniest book of the year. Ben also wrote Dear Bill Bryson, Footnotes from a Small Island, which was featured in The Guardian, The Times, and on BBC Radio, and was described by the Manchester Review as a poignant comment on the state of the nation and a highly accomplished homage. So welcome, Ben. Then we have Mike Manson's new novel, Down in Demerara, which concerns an Englishman who is plucked from his humdrum job and dispatched to the forbidden rainforest of Guyana on a mysterious assignment. Faye Weldon, no less, calls the book fast-moving and wonderfully funny. I laughed out loud. Vigorous and intelligent tale of an innocent abroad. A fantastic endorsement from Faye Weldon. The Jamaica Gleaner described it as storytelling at its best. Mike's previous novels are Rules of the Road and Where's My Money, which was featured on the BBC's Books That Made Britain series. So welcome, Mike Manson. And then we have, let me just scroll down the screen here, Amanda Gary, who is a co-founder and facilitator for I can't say this, articulation. Can you say this, Amanda, because I'm struggling with this? Tarticulation, yes. You need a bit of a run up for that one, don't you? Portsmouth spoken word troupe and a director of Portsmouth's Writers Hub. Amanda Gary is in the final stages of a PhD in creative writing. Good luck with that, quite a journey. She received Arts Council funding via Portsmouth City Council's Library and Archive Services as their poet in residence in 2019. She is published in a number of anthologies, including the London magazine. Oh, great. I've contributed to that. So hello, fellow writer. A part-time lecturer, she recently turned her hand to writing the pilot for a tourist app alongside Tom Sykes and other colleagues. Her work includes poetry and prose and is centered on place and folklore invested in it. That sounds like my kind of jam, Amanda. So looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Then we have Tom Sykes. Hello, Tom, who's the author of The Realm of the Punisher, travels in Duterte, Philippines. Is that right, Tom?
Duterte, but
Duterte, Philippines. Mea culpa.
I don't mind. He's a horrible man, so I don't mind if you offend him. If he happens to be watching this, which is unlikely.
Right. Which, according to the Times literary supplement, quote, conveys in an affectionate, unpatronizing tone the many layers of injustice that runs through the Philippines and uses interviews and site visits to try to explain the eccentric ways and popular appeal of its more muscular leaders, in quotes. Tom is the author of Ivory Coast, the Brat Guide, and his travel journalism has appeared in the Telegraph, Private Eye, New Statesman, New African, and The Scotsman, and many other titles. He is senior lecturer in creative writing at the University of Portsmouth. Oh, fantastic. I used to do a bit of teaching there, so hello, Portsmouth. So what a fabulous panel. So please give a warm welcome to Tom, Amanda, Mike, and Ben.
Brilliant. Thank you. Hi, everyone. And thanks to our audience for joining us as well. Really looking forward to the panel. Tom's going to kick off with a bit of a writing exercise this morning. So get your pen and paper ready, or if you are writing on your laptop or computer, then feel free to do so. Brilliant. Over to you, Tom. Thank you.
Thanks, James. I hope this doesn't, I don't know if it's the same with you at Bournemouth, but at Portsmouth, we're still technically on our Easter break. And I don't want this to feel too much like you've been brought back to school prematurely for those few students who are here. But anyway, I hope this this activity will be reasonably fun anyway. I call it, I'm just going to share my screen. Let me know if that is unsuccessful. You should be able to see it now. Can you see that all right? Good.
Yeah, that's working.
Grand. So this is called, it's an activity I call Details. And what it does is really get we as writers thinking about all the different senses that we have at our disposal, the ways that we can experience and describe the world, not just visually, because I think describing the world visually is the sort of reflex or go-to sort of action that writers use. So this helps, I think, to sort of get us thinking in sort of multi-sensory terms about writing about place, basically. So I'm going to begin with just asking you to think about a travel destination. It can be anywhere, near or far, exotic or not, doesn't matter. I think it's very important that we, for all travel writers, to sort of realize that you know, you don't have to go to particularly far-flung places to write well about place, or to write well about your travels. So what I'd like you to do is I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes on each of these different sort of categories to first of all write down 2 or 3 sites that come to you when you remember or you picture this travel site, this travel destination. If you can be as specific as you possibly can, because writing, I think good writing is really about detail, and being as detailed as you possibly can. You know, when writing one of these descriptions, be very specific about the sort of colors of these phenomena, the shades, the sizes, corners, shapes, textures, and try and think especially of things that seem sort of visually poetic or beautiful to you. There's just a 1-line or a kind of 2-sentence example there. Ribbons of bougainvillea brightened the traffic islands. Well-groomed men in shorts sold helium balloons with Disney characters on them. That's a scene from the Philippines, which is James referenced my book about that. So yes, I'll give you a couple of minutes just to come up with, as I say, just in note form, brief descriptions of memorable sites from your travel destination.
For those who've just joined us, I've just admitted a few more people into the meeting. Welcome. We've just got an activity on the screen now from one of our writers, Tom. So have a go at this. Hopefully you can see the screen and the instructions there, but do let us know if that's not visible.
So the next one, as you can see here, is sounds, the things that we hear. Jot down a few sounds that you associate with that place. Not just the obvious and most memorable stuff, you know, the sort of the sounds that seem to kind of dominate somewhere. If if you're near a bell when it's ringing, then that's a very noticeable sound. But also kind of smaller or more subtle background noises and sounds. Examples could be children's laughter from out of sight, draft of lager filling up. That sounds a bit early to be thinking about that, isn't it? But so when you think about it, it's something that we take for granted, I think, sound and sounds. If you were to if you had time on your hands and you sat down anywhere and really analysed what you could hear, you'd find, I think, quite a lot going on. So, yeah. Next one is, you can probably starting to predict these now. Taste. Food evokes places. I think we can all agree with that. Often when people ask us, what do you recall about a particular trip or a particular journey you made? Food is something that we recall and is very important to us. What tastes did you encounter in this place? You can, I think it's a craft or a skill to be able to describe the tastes of food, which is why we have a whole kind of subgenre of food writing. But also things like temperature, the feel of food in your mouth is also important. If you can try to capture a taste that was new to you, because again, that's something that we do when we have these adventures, when we travel, is that we try and try out things for the first time. This is for Hattie, who's just put in the chat, what's the task? Hattie, if you can just be really following the instructions more or less on the screen, if you can see them now, and just write down, think of a travel destination that you've been to, and write down just in note form a few brief descriptions based on the categories so at the moment we're looking at taste. So if you can try and recall the tastes of food that you tried in this place, there's an example there as well in italics. So yeah. So next one is smell. Like taste, I think our sense of smell gives us a very kind of visceral connection to a memory of a place, or to just memories generally, I think. Again, challenge yourself here, try and summarize or describe a smell that was unusual or unfamiliar to you. There are good and bad smells, obviously, wherever you go. Try new combinations of the familiar to convey a new experience. Perhaps very often when we encounter a new smell, we have to, where we can really sort of compute it or understand it is by referencing sort of smells and things that we do know already. So a few examples: whiff of sewage, the iron tang of the water, the cellar's mustiness. Again, potentially lots and lots of possible smells to describe if you think about it. I'm going to speed up a little bit just to get on to some of the other categories. Touch. Try to recall some of the physical feelings of the journey and the place. You know, again, there are different ways of breaking this down. You know, there are sort of things that feel hot and cold to the touch, rough and smooth. There are things that you touch and things that touch you, if that doesn't sound too weird. So you think, you know, things that touch you that you don't have control over. So weather, wind, rain, things like that might be worth recalling and describing. The rim of a glass, again, this can link into what you taste, what you eat, what you sort of consume with your mouth, if you like. And then things that you touch as part of that experience. You know, yak's coat, sort of an unusual one, but whether kind of natural or human-made things, you know, depending on the sort of environment that you're traveling in. And finally, this is a sort of cheat one. This doesn't technically fall into our kind of, you know, human senses, but it's an interesting one nonetheless, I think, and it kind of ties into touch, which is what I'd call bodily, you know, your body position, your posture. This obviously is can be relevant if you're traveling in let's say a kind of low budget non-deluxe way. I think we've all had experiences of being kind of crammed into a car or a back of a, you know, truck or a you know, a train, sort of not very good train service, much like all of them in Britain, in my experience. So, you know, again, there are different ways of describing that. You know, you can feel very comfortable, you can feel awkward, stretched, cramped, turned, straight. So I suppose this one relates to how you may have traveled somewhere rather than necessarily where you arrived, but maybe where you arrived resulted in some kind of awkward bodily positioning, who knows. But okay, I think we'll stop there, if that's all right. Would anyone like to share one or two of theirs? I'm always interested to hear people's responses to this activity. Any of our students, would be great to hear from you.
Feel free to either type it into the chat or unmute yourself. That'll be fine.
Kevin, you're saying that you chose your neck of the woods. I should have gone for a tuk-tuk in Thailand. Well, that's fine. I think sometimes it's more challenging to write about, what is close to you and sort of immediate to you.
Absolutely, sort of defamiliarizing it and seeing it with fresh eyes. I mean, I can share, for what it's worth, my little efforts
Please,
to get the, to prime the pumps, if nobody wants to pitch in. So this is up on the Marlborough Downs. This was the very first part of Tom's activities, so I won't kind of like bore you with the rest, but I came with the 3 visuals: a hare running across the field, ears like exclamation marks, the wind shredding through the gorse, blazing into gold, and then fists of rock scattered across the field, broken pots in a pottery, first drafts of a 5,000-year work in progress. So,
superb. Thank you, Kevin. Very good.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kevin. Anyone else got anything they'd like to share? Ben's got, I was writing down some phrases or lines. Thick seagrass that stirs in the wind. Nice. Crisp cool air mixed with an essence of dried seaweed and salt water. Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. Really evocative there.
Yeah, very much.
Use of the sentences. Use of the senses. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Mike was pondering the smell of fish. What does rotting fish actually smell of? Or is it our reaction to the smell? Gut wrenching. Brilliant. Yeah, good questions there.
Yeah. Yeah, presumably the smell of rotting fish doesn't put off plenty of other creatures that are happy just to go along and eat what's left. So
yeah,
it must be a human problem.
Yeah, it could be. Cole has got on about how everything in Rome feels ancient, the stone, the water, even the air, which is a really nice thought, concept of the air being ancient. There's just something about that city. Brilliant, thank you. Richard, the smell of the frangipani tree outside the window, the crash of surf from the ocean below, the sight of the moon reflected on the harbour. Beautiful imagery there. Really nice. I mean, that could almost work as a haiku, couldn't it? Yeah, wonderful. Robin, I wanted a hot chocolate from the cafe. I thought that was the whole point. Instead, I'm left to hydrate on the sweat running off my top lip, hot but peppered with salt. Brilliant.
Nice. Very good.
Great, thank you. These are great. Brilliant.
There's I like there's especially Richards and Robbins. There's a real kind of nice rhythm and cadence to those descriptions. So very good. Yeah.
Lily has small groups of people walking without their masks on, feeling strangely naked to look at. Yeah, that's interesting. Speaking languages you're not used to hearing anymore now that the tourists are gone. So a real sense of perhaps a present moment, with a lot of the changes that are happening right now. Brilliant. Thank you. Great. Sounds like some great starting points for people to have one.
I think what I like about this activity, it's worth just doing it for its own sake, but it's also a way of really getting a first draft together. This is often what I do when I'm sort of drafting out a travel story. I start with these very kind of raw experiences or raw reflections on a place, and then from there you start to build something more coherent and sort of linear out of it. So yeah, I think it's useful for that. A lot of my students, when I do this on my travel writing module at Portsmouth, it's nice to see them. They'll read out their responses to this at week 1 or 2, and then by the time they submit their portfolio, you'll see a kind of fully formed travel story that has its kind of origins in the activity. So it's I think they use it as a kind of way of drafting their stories, and I do as well. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. So yeah, definitely something you can take away, and maybe even also give yourself even longer. Sit down with those senses and really um, sit with them. Think, reflect on them as that starting point. Yeah, brilliant. I'll definitely use these as well. Thank you,
Yeah,
Tom.
please dig in.
I've got a little kind of question for everybody, really. I just wondered if anybody responded to Tom's brilliant activity synesthesically, using one sense to describe another. I mean, it's really useful to start with the separate ones, but sometimes, you can create some really interesting effects by using a smell to describe a sound or whatever. Did anybody do that? Because I know some people are synesthetic anyway.
It's really interesting. I'm just looking back to see if I did that unintentionally.
Yeah. I mean, it just sometimes happens almost by accident. But it's worth kind of trying to do that, maybe as a second stage, Tom, to this activity, to start mixing up the senses.
Yeah, no, it's a good idea. I mean, it reminds me of the work of someone like Patrick Leigh Fermor, who's a brilliantly descriptive travel writer. I sometimes think that's sort of all he's very good at, to be honest. There's not much narrative substance underneath it, but what he does is very inventive with the verbs that he uses, and part of that will be a kind of synesthesia of using a kind of idiom that you'd associate with sound to describe a smell or describe a sight or something. So there are these precedents in the sort of canon of travel writing. So absolutely, it's
it looks like Robin has attempted that as well. Sound and smell sections definitely ran into one another. That's great.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Yeah, sounds good. We've got a few more responses there as well. So Richard says, the strange shape of the clouds when the high winds of the mountains meet the warm air of the plains. Lovely. And then Monica, sat on the balcony of my house, which I bought last year. And is that? Sorry if I pronounced that wrong. One of the towns, I was perfectly sure I know purpose of life. The color of the sky during the day is wonderful. We would rip that of meaning if we would say it is blue. It is the deepest shade of blue, not the darkest, but deepest, where we feel as we are part of that sky. It is part of us. Sunsets might take us to a different world of magic and fairies, world of unconditional love and desire. Looking at that sky, we know we are in the proper place at the proper time. Simply saying it is happiness, the great sense of worth. Lovely, thank you. Brilliant. I love that sense of actually just describing something as blue would actually rip it of its meaning. That's a great image there. Elizabeth, I wrote about Lanzarote and now miss it even more. Wildflowers in a gradient from magenta to blood orange, spindly palm trees with thick lush leaves like a bird's plumage. Sunscreen layered on so thick you can smell it in the air, mingled with the thick afternoon heat. I think probably this is anyone been to Bournemouth in the summer. I think also this could be reminiscent of that. Flip-flops slapping against stone, cluttering from the gazebo bars lining the seafront, clinking of ice in the glasses, whisper of a light breeze against your skin. Lovely poetic images there. Brilliant. Okay, good. Richard saw PLF leaping across the mountaintops in the Mali one. Brilliant. He was in the distance taking a group of students around. Great. Awesome. Brilliant. So lots of great responses there. So as we said, yeah, do build on those. Do use them as a starting point for development. So wonderful. Brilliant. So we just thought we would hear from each of our guest speakers about their journey into writing, into travel writing, their experiences of being published, as well as any sort of top tips. So I thought, if it's okay, could we start with Ben? If that's all right. It'd just be really interesting to hear more about that journey, some of these really exciting projects that you've been working on, whether that's Dear Bill Bryson or the Grand Tour more recently. It'd be great to hear about those in your journey.
Yeah, it'd be nice to share a few things with you. Thanks for the invitation to speak this morning. And nice listening to some of the fruits of those exercises. But yeah, I will crack on and try and put in a nutshell what's happened to me as a travel writer. It started accidentally, really, just writing longer and longer postcards, which gave me a clue that I was quite fond of describing my adventures and my trips and my journeys, and not always to far-flung exotic places. I sometimes went to Basingstoke for the weekend and would write long emails about the experience, which gave me another clue that it wasn't just celebrated, heralded places that I was drawn to. My first long piece of travel writing was a series of diaries in the first instance, which I kept whilst retracing the journey taken by Bill Bryson in his quite famous travel book, Notes from a Small Island, which is set in the UK. So being a bit of a devil, I just picked up his book and followed it to the letter. So if he spent 45 minutes in the bath in Bournemouth, I did the same. And if he had a Chinese meal in Liverpool, I did the same, and so on. So I came back 2 months later with a set of diaries, which I slowly transcribed onto the computer. And when that first draft was finished, I was too scared to package it up and propose it to agents or publishers. So I went down the self-publishing route, which involved a Kickstarter, which is a crowdfunding platform, through which I raised about £8,000, which enabled me to contract some designers, editors, printers, and also set up a independent press called Not Bad Books. The advantage of setting up a small independent press is that it makes it easier to get your self-published book into distributors and bookshops. So that was my first stab, and the real value of self-publishing is you learn an awful lot, but you also learn how to finish something. And I think that was the key, most crucial thing for me, was learning how to finish a complete travel story, which gave me the confidence to then move to Poland. And I lived in Poland in a city called Poznan for a year. And I worked in a fish and chip shop and traveled the country and had a look at the people, and they had a look at me. And I did that whilst keeping a diary and with the confidence that the diaries would amount to something. And this time I would write up that first draft, package it, and do the hard thing of trying to get the interest of a publisher or an agent. And 100% of the agents I wrote to didn't write back, which was charming. 99% of the publishers I wrote to didn't write back, which was equally charming. But one publisher, which accepts submissions from the author directly rather than through an agent, one publisher called Aiken, were taken by the working title of the book, which was 50 Shades of Poland, which was suitably awful to get their attention. And she at least read the first pages and was enthusiastic enough to contact me to sort of explain more about where the book was going and so on. So that amounted to and resulted in my first traditionally published book, which was a chip shop in Poznan, which came out summer 2019. And because that did reasonably well commercially for them, they were brave enough to give me another stab, another go. And I wrote a book called The Grand Tour, which I've got a copy of here. Travels with my elders. I took 6 budget, all-inclusive coach holidays around the UK and Europe with people twice or thrice my age in a bid to learn a thing or two. And so that book came out in September last year, and I'm now working on my 4th travel book. So that's, in short, the journey I've been on, and I'd be very happy to take any questions or elaborate on anything else that you would like me to, James or Tom or any of the students.
Brilliant, thank you. That's a great introduction to your work, and Tom's putting in some of the where you can find those books there in the chat, so do take a look if you haven't already. Yeah, I mean, there's so much there that I think will be beneficial to hear more about. So how did you go about this process of setting up your setting up Not Bad Books? How do you begin doing something like that? And do you have any top tips for anyone thinking of working in that area?
You just need a bit of bravado, to be frank, and it's not that complicated. It was a publishing house in the sense that there was a writer involved, which was me. There was a designer who was the guy I was sharing a co-working space with. And then you sort of outsource all of the other bits and pieces. So you can get an editor to do a bit of this, and you can get a printer to do this. So all of the facets of a publishing house are reduced to 2 or 3 people doing it on a budget in the first instance for one book. And you wrap the whole endeavor and enterprise up in the sort of clothes of a small publishing house, which just needs a name, it needs a website, just needs to register it as a business, which you can do in about 45 minutes. And that enables you to approach distributors and bookshops and encourage them, ask them to stock your work, which to all intents and purposes is self-published. But because you've taken this extra effort and played the game a little bit to give the impression that it's come from an independent publishing house, which in effect it has, you stand a better chance of having your books stocked in the likes of Waterstones, Foyles, Blackwells, etc., which is what most writers would like. So that was a case of getting some people together with various talents and then marshalling those talents and then wrapping the whole endeavor up in the right packaging. That was how Not Bad Books came about, and it proved successful. I can't remember if there was a second part to your question, James, whether it was focused on the self-publishing.
It was just hearing a bit more about that process, and that's really, really interesting. I think what we're trying to do with our degree is really prepare students for different avenues into publishing. So that's really interesting to hear about, and something for them to consider. And perhaps those who have come externally to the uni, maybe that's something for you to consider as well. I was just thinking also about this journey then into working with Icon Books. How did that change from, working on it as your own sort of company with Not Bad Books and then moving into this relationship with Icon Books? How did that progress? Was there any challenges there that you hadn't perhaps foreseen?
Yes, it's a bittersweet transition, really, because you forego the absolute autonomy and independence you had as a self-publisher or having your own small publishing house. And instead, you have to be in constant dialogue with more than one person about what the book should be and what it shouldn't be and such things. All things considered, I wouldn't return to the self-publishing avenue because it requires an awful lot of legwork. It requires you to wear about a dozen hats at once. You have to be this, that, and everything. The pleasure and privilege of having the support of a traditional publisher is that they're liable. So they put up the money to print, to design, to distribute. They have a reputation. They have a standing within the industry, which makes supplying retailers as easy as clicking a button. And also you benefit from the constructive, if sometimes painful, process of editing. My first book, Dear Bill Bryson, is probably about 464 pages too long because I wasn't able to kill my darlings. I wasn't able to understand or see which bits were maybe more superfluous or weaker or tangential than others. And you are disabused of those illusions when you have a good editor who's more than happy to tell you where you might have gone wrong or where passages wander or meander or whatnot. So yes, I would reiterate that the self-publishing route is a great way to cut your teeth and to learn how to finish something and learn about the mechanics of the industry broadly. It gives you an insight into distribution, what a bookshop is looking for when it chooses its titles, what reviewers, how to contact a reviewer, how to get them to consider reviewing your book, how to manage online retailing, how to supply Amazon, how to upload an ebook, how to get some ISBN numbers, how to supply the British Library. So the first experience of self-publishing and the establishment of a small press is immensely valuable in giving you that rounded experience of writing and publishing. But I won't lie by saying that moving to a traditional publisher who do a lot of that legwork for you isn't satisfying. But it's awfully competitive. But that shouldn't be a deterrent. The fact that it's competitive should act as a spur and a motivation, and you believe in your work and give it your best shot. There are probably a dozen publishers that will receive submissions directly from the author, and you should know who those publishers are, and you should be enthusiastic about reaching out to them. And agents is a different kettle of fish. Expect to hear back from an agent 5 years after you've sent the proposal. That's what it is. And yes, I think I've just about answered the question there, James.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Kavan's got a question, I believe.
Yes, Ben, I'm interested in your methodology. You mentioned about the Bill Bryson book, drinking where he drank and eating where he ate and so on. I'm really interested in this sort of experiential approach to writing. I call it method writing myself. I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that and why you think it's effective for you.
It was effective in the sense that it took the element of decision making and choice out of the equation, which was quite liberating. It's a bit of a paradox, isn't it, that when you have less freedom to choose, it can actually result in a sense of liberation. I wouldn't say the same is true of the last 12 months during the pandemic, but in the sort of context of travel writing, when you've got a template and an example and you're just following, it can allow the rest of your mind, the different faculties, to be otherwise engaged instead of having to deal with the logistics of left, right, here, there, thither, wherever. And so I liked that lightness that was enabled and delivered by being in pursuit of someone. And it gave you an interlocutor. By pursuing Bill Bryson, I had someone to converse with on the page, and also to use us as a sort of fall guy and a foil. And it felt like there was a duo at the center of the story. It comes with dangers, of course, especially taking on or writing a sort of homage to Bill Bryson. You may well attract some readers who are fans of Bill Bryson, because there are plenty of them, but you will experience, or you will learn, that those readers are probably hoping for more of the same. They're hoping for more writing like Bill Bryson's. And so you're setting yourself up for a bit of a fall by taking on a literary travel writing heavyweight. But you take the bruises and you improve, and you apply them to your work, and then you move on. Since Bill Bryson, I haven't engaged in something similar, because I think the risks of that type of project and book are maybe greater than the rewards, because you might be accused of lacking originality or clinging to the coattails of genius and X, Y, and Z. But
And that's really interesting. I mean, I personally really like the experiential approach, because it kind of reveals telling details that no amount of online research could ever reveal, that little thing that you only notice by being there, having that experience. It also means you end up having an adventure as well, So I'm a full subscriber to that approach. But I know, you know, some people just research it all from home, and that can be just as valid sometimes. So, but thank you for your answer there. That was great.
Ian, thank you. I think Richard's got a question.
Yes. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Richard. Yeah.
Okay, great. Ben, I think that you first wrote a play, didn't you? I have got the right Ben, haven't I?
You have, yeah.
Yes. I was in a workshop with you with John Haynes and read one of your parts before you put it on stage. But my question is, did you find writing the dialogue in a play and the experience actually helps now you're writing travel books instead? Because in my opinion, dialogue is one of the most difficult. I escape that. If I write about places, I write poetry instead. And so you don't really need dialogue in it in the same way.
Yeah.
But if you're writing a book like Bill Bryson's books, you do. I mean, I'd go more like songlines. And if I was writing a travel book, it would be actually poetic expressions of places I visited but you write about people, obviously, and experiences with people. So you have to have natural dialogue. And I would have thought that writing a drama was possibly the best way to learn about dialogue. But I'm really asking you. Oh, and hi, it's nice to meet you again.
Yeah, that's one of the problems with people, Richard. They say things. Now you're very right in thinking that writing plays is a good way of sharpening and improving one's handling of dialogue. And yeah, nice to see you again. I remember that workshop. That was in Havant, wasn't it? And
that's right, yes.
It was the first few pages of a play called The Cafe.
A restaurant.
Called The Cafe, yeah. And it actually ended up having productions in Brighton and London, just small ones. But it was nice to see that thing come to life eventually. And yeah, I started off writing plays because I was drawn to the life that these works have off the page. You get to have that exciting transitional moment when a cast is assembled and then the whole thing comes to life, and you don't get that with writing travel books. But for one reason or another, for better or worse, I made that transition, and definitely I have confidence with dialogue when I'm writing these travel books, and in large part because I got used to writing hundreds and hundreds of pages of just dialogue. And I think that gives you an ear for it. It gives you a certain facility for it. You know, you'll never be perfect, and you'll never please everybody. You know, some people might suggest it's contrived. Some might suggest the dialogue's plain. Some might suggest it's excellent. But you have to sort of put aside all of those concerns and just execute as you feel fit and to the best of your ability.
I suspected that. Thank you very much. Good to see you again too.
Brilliant, thank you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Ben. That was brilliant. And if it's okay now, we're going to move on, and it'd be really lovely to hear from Amanda of Articulation about your writing journey and your travel adventures.
Yes, well, I'm not technically published in the main thing that I'm doing, which is perhaps a little odd. I'm essentially a novel writer, and my PhD is a PhD in praxis, where I'm writing a novel and the concomitant exegesis that goes with it. But my travel writing is based, of course, on place, and that comes a lot into my novels. So when I'm traveling, I'm researching particularly things like landscape and how folklore fits into it. So I'm interested in the historical landscape and the myth and legend that builds up around that. and any sort of goddesses and such like that find themselves lurking in those places. So I, when I'm traveling, I often, because I'm a woman of a certain age, I'm perhaps a little more nervous than our younger friends, and I would find it difficult to travel alone. And to some places I've actually gone on packages, but I refuse when I'm on package tours to comply. So when we're asked to all get in a coach to do this one thing, when we get off the coach, I do something else and I go wandering off. And I particularly like to talk to local people, and I'm making inquiry of local people and getting involved in conversation. And those people often find themselves then as characters in some way in my novel writing. The folklore thing is interesting in that you find very similar things wherever you go. So wherever in the world you are, you will have river goddesses, for instance, and they will perform in the same sorts of ways. They will set up the same fears and things. So that's quite an interesting thing to use in your writing. It was quite interesting. I specifically went to Croatia and Bosnia in order to look at the folklore there. And I kept finding denial. There just wasn't any. Nobody would talk about anything. And I could only find very small clues to it. So there was a cafe in one little corner called Serena, which was a hint at mermaids for the siren. And I found a carving in a museum which had mermaids on it, but that was about it. And that was really kind of curious to me. And I think that, you know, as Yugoslavia, that had all been phased out of the culture somehow. And when I came back, I did some sort of deeper research and found references to the folklore in historical documents. So things that were over 100 years old, I could find references to the folklore there. So I found that really quite interesting. And I built that into a novel. And that novel, so there's a curious story here and perhaps a word of warning, really, about putting manuscripts in the hands of agents, because I had quite a lot of interest in that novel. I had really good feedback from Alison Owens, who was the editor-in-chief of the Writers and Artists Yearbook. I had an introduction to her and a meeting with her, and she was very helpful, and she gave me really good feedback on my work and encouragement. And off the back of that, I was put in touch with an agent, and the work went off to the agent at their behest. And I was absolutely thrilled, wonderful. You know, this was an agent which dealt with some pretty big names, Ben Ockrey being one. And, you know, I was glowing. I thought, this is fantastic. You know, here we go, maybe. You know, there's nothing guaranteed. But I heard nothing. And like Ben was saying, it can maybe take 5 years. But after about 6 months, I thought, maybe I ought to chase this up. And so I was emailing her at her address with the agency that she was with, and I was getting nothing. So in the end, I contacted the agency, and it seemed that the week that I sent the manuscript off to her, which was the week following the meeting with her, she was headhunted. She'd had a huge success and was headhunted. And my manuscript then kind of lay on a desk in that agency. The agency wouldn't touch it because it was addressed to her, but neither would they pass it on because it was addressed to her at their agency and she'd done the dirty on them. So it kind of lay fallow for a year, by which time I was fully engaged in the PhD and I just have not gone back to it. So it lays in a back drawer. I still have hopes that it will be published. It will need some revision because time has moved on. And it was about a character who actually had been a hotelier, a very young hotelier in Dubrovnik, that I engaged in a lot of conversation and then used the basis of her to develop a character and a story. And it was about this main character coming to England and working as a domestic servant in the area that I grew up in, which is my real sense of place, is the folklore and landscape around my home village. And so I was trying to, or I have translated the experiences of somebody in a place like Dubrovnik and put them in a rural setting in England, so very, very different to their own upbringing. And I've used that to contrast the two places. It's written in a first person narrative. What else can I say? It was my writing about place really that got me the gig as poet in residence for what's now my home city of Portsmouth. And that was fantastic because it was a gig with the Library and Archives Service, and I had access for almost a year to the archives here, and so could really get into the history of the place. And I wrote poetry for that, and that was a very enjoyable experience. As for actual travel, I started backpacking in my 50s because I was scared of flying. I'd read newspaper articles in the 1960s which talked about wings falling off of planes due to metal fatigue. That was a killer for me about flying. But actually my family forced me into a position where I had to fly or not see some of them again. And I discovered I actually loved it once I got up there. And so I've been to more far-flung places like India now, and have gone into Eastern Europe, as I've already said, and those are informing my writing currently. What I would suggest is that you take opportunities to take yourself off the normal tourist routes. I'm sure that goes without saying for most people. But it didn't really for me initially because, I was a bit timid, having not been to those sorts of places before. But one of my enduring memories, actually brought up by the exercise that Tom was doing, was being in the Dominican Republic and being told by the tour guide, you have to book a taxi through the hotel desk, and we'll make sure it's all clean and sanitized and wonderful. And thinking, well, sod that, because firstly, it's 3 or 4 times more expensive and I've got no dosh. But actually, I don't want the sanitized version. I want to be in there and experiencing everything. So any little excursions I did with a local company. But I also decided I wanted to go to other towns and townships, and I just got myself in a guagua, which is basically, for anybody who's not been there, is a car with the doors taken off, the boot hatch taken off to get more people in. So on one occasion there were 23 of us in a 9-person vehicle, and with those doors off, the way you are safe is because other people have their arms around you, so it's very intimate and it's absolutely fantastic. And so it's good stuff to do. So that's my story so far. My PhD finishes in July. That's my submission date, at least. There's the Viva after that, but I've got a lot more plans after that. And yeah, partly with Tom's encouragement, actually, I've got some projects that once we're allowed to travel more widely, that I intend to do.
That's fantastic, Amanda. Thank you so much. And it'd be lovely to have some questions now, but to get the ball rolling, I've got one for you. I'm really interested in your writing of place, something I'm deeply interested in as well. And I really believe that, you know, it's a different kind of travel. There's a certain kind of verticality to the writing of place. It's not about going a long distance to somewhere far flung and exotic. It's about going deep. And I think the best example of that is somebody called Nan Shepherd, who was based in the Cairngorms for actually her whole life. And she wrote a sort of mini classic called The Living Mountain that Robert Macfarlane introduced. And basically she came up with this idea of deep mapping, about just getting to know one area really, really well, in her case, over decades. And, you know, I think that's like one of the best ways to approach travel writing. Not the only way, but it's something that I'm really interested in. I've been doing a kind of version of that deep mapping in my neck of woods up here on the Marlborough Downs. But I'm just really interested in your approach to this form of place writing. I think it's connected to something called psychogeography, but it's a different approach. You know, maybe more flanus than the flaneur. You know, there's a lot of men who do psychogeography and like to pontificate about their, you know, ideas. But yeah, there's a more of a female approach. Rebecca Solnit is a great kind of practitioner of this. I would be interested to know about your approach to, you know, going deep, writing place.
Yeah, it is more about talking to people. Obviously, you know, I'll go to museums and cultural places. I'll try and have local experiences. So, you know, definitely not go to any shows and things that are put on to entertain the tourist, but to actually go and experience things in the local language as well, even if you're not able to translate that language, if you're not able to fully understand what's going on, because most things are, you know, transmitted visually as well, and I think that's really quite important. And when it's in those sorts of places, those sorts of experiences, you're finding out how the locals interact with each other, and they're also very interested and accommodating of you if you're showing that sort of interest, and they open up to you, which is fantastic.
Yeah, you're not being just a tourist, are you?
Yes.
The voyeur.
So it's a far different experience to engage with local people than to just go on this almost conveyor belt of being a tourist somewhere.
I was particularly fascinated by your focus on rivers, and you know, I think a lot can be discovered from place names, looking at maps and so on, even just like, you know, street signs and stuff like that. What is that neighborhood called, that street, that pub? So yeah, I think there's a lot to be discovered through etymology. So are you a bit of a kind of a word hunter in this way?
Yeah, yes, I am. And you know, the cafe with the title Serena, you know, was one of those specific things. And in Dubrovnik, I was asking about the names of the little sort of alleys and streets and things, and you know, whether that connected to any old stories, and people said no, but I kept asking, and I came up, then somebody said, oh, there is one, and they told me what it was in Croatian, which of course meant nothing to me, but it translated as Granny's Elbow. So there was this little windy street bit that was called Granny's Elbow. So I, you know, asked a little more, and they didn't know very much. So I concocted a story around it.
Nice.
So that sort of thing, certainly. But my home village, which is Hook Norton in North Oxfordshire, has a lot of interesting things, but it's slap bang in the middle of the country. So you might imagine, you know, that there's not much water there, but it has about 40 streams and rivers in the just around it, and so there's a heck of a lot of water there, really. So that was the sort of commonality between there and a character from Dubrovnik, was water. That was the main thing in common. Different types of water, although there's the two rivers near to Dubrovnik. So right on the edge of Dubrovnik, there's the Ombla. So I write about that in the novel, and then there's the Neretva, which is a little further afield, and that excuse the pun, really, afield. But so that again is significant, becomes significant in the story, and she's relating her experiences in Croatia, and she has an aunt who's from Bosnia, because of course the families were interrelated and that. So all of that gets brought into Oxfordshire, and her comfort places in the landscape in Oxfordshire are where water is, because that's what she needs.
Fascinating. I don't want to kind of hog you. Does anybody have any questions for Amanda or comments? Looks like Natalia lived not far from Hook Norton. Is that right, Natalia? Nice little connection. Another Oxfordshire lass. Should be Norton, yes.
Place. It's a great place.
Yes. So yes, any other comments or questions for Amanda? I could talk with you all day, Amanda, but
I'm not sure if Richard still has his hand up from before.
Oh yes, sorry, Richard. Go ahead.
You're muted, Richard.
Unmute yourself, Richard.
Sorry, I went out quickly to get a wine delivery, and I must have muted it then. Sorry, Amanda. Amanda, I share your love of folklore, and I was in Yugoslavia just before it split up, and in Slovenia. We took a trip up into the Julian Alps, and the guide said, if you look, some people can see the semblance of a young woman up there, which they say is the Virgin Mary. And I looked, and it was obvious that it might be a virgin, but it was the tripartite goddess in the young form originally, rather than the Virgin Mary. But the only remembrance they had was that it was the Virgin Mary, which is the way that Christianity steals pagan fables. And the only other question I have in there as well, I went into the art gallery museum, and there were loads of pictures of slugs and snails as demons, raping young women, terrorizing the place and so on. And as a gardener, this instantly hit me. But it's the only time I've seen so many visual representations, and they made nothing of it at all. And I wondered if you would ever come across that same thing. Because to someone who depends for their life on their vegetables with no pesticides, that would probably be as bad as an invader.
Absolutely. And I'm really interested to hear about that. And I might do a little bit of digging to see what else I could find about that. So yeah, really, really interesting. One of the things that I did, so my trip into Bosnia was actually a car journey. I hired along with a friend, because I usually take a companion with me. It's almost as cheap for two of you to go, and so you can fund a little bit of them in order to encourage them, so you feel safer going as a woman of my age, perhaps, going into more remote places. So we hired a chap with a car, and he just happened to have a master's degree in the history, and we drove up to Mostar, but we stopped off at a couple of places en route. And one of them was Medjugorje. And Medjugorje is the sort of Eastern European version of Lords. And it was in the Troubles, in the difficulties in the early 90s, that suddenly there was a sighting of the Virgin. And that was the closest thing that I found to anything folkloric. And it seemed to be a reaction to me to the war situation that they were in, which was seriously dividing the families, because there'd been a lot of encouragement for families from different ethnic backgrounds to relate, to marry, and then there was this division again, and so whole communities were ripped apart. And it felt to me that these young people who had seen this apparition, if you like, had been encouraged to create this bigger story around it, and certainly the priest was involved in that. And so in what had been this tiny place way up in the mountains, they'd put extensions on the church, and they'd actually got a huge television screen out the back of it, and an amphitheater at the back of the church to view this screen. And they had coachloads of people going there to this really remote place. But that's the kind of only thing that I found. I did make up a story about babies and rivers and things for the Naretva, and that then transpired later when I did this deeper research historically. I found similar stories, so that was quite interesting as well. I just used my instinctive reaction to the landscape that I saw there in order to come up with that story. So to find out it was very similar to the stories that already existed pre-Yugoslavia was interesting.
I did wonder vaguely about, I totally agree about rivers in Europe and the way they're regarded. I did wonder, having done some research into Australian Aboriginal folklore legends, whether in fact it's universal, the way that rivers are regarded, but rivers are far rarer in Australia anyway. And I'm not sure about Africa and America, but it's so long ago since I did any anthropology that I can't say for sure.
I'm afraid at times river flows on, but great question, Richard, and thank you so much, Amanda. I love a couple of lovely comments in the chat from Monica and Mike as well about travel. Perhaps everybody can share their favourite way of travel there, but thank you once again, Amanda, and I'm going to pass back over to James now.
Lovely, thank you. Wonderful. If possible, could we turn to Mike? I think there might be some synergies there as a novelist. How do you involve that research into place, and how do you translate that into fiction?
Thank you, everybody. There's so many interesting themes going around. I suppose I'm not really a travel writer as such, but the kind of travel often plays a big part in what I write. I was just interested in Ben about publishing, how he got published, and I've been published by a variety of publishers. I've self-published as well, and there is no set route into getting published. I think you really have to find your own way. It's can be a heartbreaking business, but you've got to be really persistent and think ways around. But so just to go back to the travel writing, my first novel, which is called Where's My Money, was set in just one building, and it's a kind of very claustrophobic, Kafkaesque sort of tale. And having written that, my challenge was to try and keep it set in just one place. And then I thought I need to get out a bit. And I wrote a kind of hippie travel book called Rules of the Road, which was a bit of a Kerouac homage, and it was basically set in the 1970s when travel was so different. And in fact, thinking about it now, I can't believe how one got around, but it was about hitchhiking, which was a very liberating form of travel, good way of meeting people. There was no, we didn't even have a map. I don't know how I got to where I was going to go. And we wrote letters to communicate. And I remember a friend of mine who suddenly ran out of money, I can't remember what, and he had to write home. And then we had to go and pick up a check about a week later. You know, it was just so different. So I did that. And to research that, I'd obviously hitchhiked in the 70s, but I decided to travel to Albania without doing any research. So I was kind of reliving my previous experience. So I set off to my little local train station, Montpellier train station in Bristol, and caught the train to Albania. And I kind of made it up. So I thought, okay, I've got to go to Paris, and from Paris I'll have to go to Venice, and then from Venice I'll go down the Croatian coast. And I did all this without doing any research. I would just turn up at a bus station, and it was just a great experience. It was so liberating not having a guidebook with this 10 things that you've got to do. My only regret was that I turned up in Venice and they were taking down a stage in St. Mark's Square, and Leonard Cohen had been playing there the night before. And I thought I would have loved to have seen that. But so that was a great experience, just kind of living without technology. And then my third travel book, I used to do labour market research, and I was invited to go to Guyana in South America. I didn't know where Guyana was. I thought it was in Africa. And I went and did a project there, and it absolutely blew my mind. And I thought I'd really like to write about this country. And so I worked up a story, and I then went back to Guyana to check out. So I wrote the book, and then I went back to fact check again. And that was very interesting in that I didn't kind of get the themes until I'd written it, and it was about the environment and about the cutting down of the rainforest and such like. And it was interesting for Amanda. There are various spirits in Guyana, one called Kanema, which explains accidents and sudden death. And I kind of joked about this in my book, Bad Kanema. And I spoke to a Native American from the Amazoni tribe, something like that. It's gone from me. And I said, tell me about Kanema, very jokingly. And he was absolutely serious. You know, this was not something to be joked about. And if you heard your name shouted in the jungle, that means you were going to die. You know, I was quite taken aback, and it brought me to my realization that these spirits are very important even today. You know, my travel experience has always been very different. But for people who are listening, the one thing that you need very little to be a writer. You don't have to wear lycra or have any special clothing or anything. But what you do need is your notebook. And this, you've got to have a notebook. You've got to write stuff down there and then, because you'll forget it. And that's just the one bit of equipment that all travel writers have, is a notebook. And it's full of stuff. And just write it down, what you know, those exercises we did earlier on, the smells, the sounds, the conversations. And you know, just little notes are so important. And then later on, when you come back, there may be various other themes that unwittingly you've gathered. So I was traveling around West Africa, Mali and Ghana, and I'd taken a big interest in the local mud architecture of the mosques, some fantastic large mud buildings. And I suddenly realized, oh, right, I've got an article here. And I looked back at my notebooks, and I was able to produce a very esoteric article on the mud mosques of the Southern Sahara, which was published in a online magazine called Elsewhere, which I don't know, it's worth checking out. Elsewhere, a journal of place. But you know, that's what you need, is a notebook. That's all you need, and perseverance. So yeah, any questions that anybody you've got?
Brilliant, thank you. It's great advice there. I think, you know, for everyone, take your notebook, don't forget that.
Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant. So yeah, opening up to any questions from anyone. I think I was quite interested in that sense where you were taken aback by some of those experiences, you were surprised, and those kind of things you can only do by visiting that place and being there and having those conversations with people. Have there been any other challenges that you've faced to translating your research or your experiences into fiction, something, you know, sort of taking it into a more fictional arena, if you like?
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, when you're moving into fiction, and you know, people might recognize themselves, and then sometimes you have to move the geography around a bit. So, you know, you want a long journey between two towns when actually they're only kind of 30 minutes away. So with the novel Down in Demerara, I did have to say the geography is slightly skewed for the purpose of the narrative. And I think you can get away with that if it's a novel. And then there's people who might recognize themselves as well. So a friend of mine, I had to warn him that he was going to be featured in this book. And my editor read the first version and said, oh, you've got to dumb down this guy. So I had to tell my friend, Pete, I'm afraid you're still in the book, but I've dumbed you down and you come over as a total idiot. But you're a very good looking guy. And he was happy with that. So that was okay. But there's, yeah, the challenge is, I think the important thing for travel writing is that if you're writing about it, you do need to go there. It sounds obvious, but some people will just look at a Google map, Street View, which is very helpful, but you don't get those smells and sounds. So, and you'll be caught out if you don't do that. So I think, you know, along with a notebook, you actually have to go there. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a question from Hattie. Did you hitchhike on your own or with mates?
I normally hitchhike with mates, and two guys hitchhiking was never a good idea because it only encouraged total nutters to pick you up. And occasionally I'd hitchhike by myself. And it was a magical way of traveling. You know, you never knew where you were going to go. I think it's definitely a different experience for a woman. And you know, my women friends who have hitchhiked by themselves, they've always been on the edge of something unexpected. But I had some very interesting experiences, and I just wish today we could do this with some sort of app. But somebody said that the downfall with hitchhiking, you could always try and get out. With central locking, you can't these days. So I can see that there are problems, but I wish somebody could invent a hitchhiking app. It's a great way to travel.
Brilliant. Cool. Thank you. I'm just conscious of the time, Mike. I think, sorry, we're going to have to move to Tom now, if that's okay. But thank you for that.
Thank you.
Tom, over to you.
Yeah, I suppose I'll just begin at the beginning, as some old drunk poet might have said. So in fact, what I'm going to say links, not that we planned this or anything, but it links quite sweetly with what Mike was just talking about with hitchhiking, because I got my foot in the door with publishing and writing by co-editing an anthology of hitchhiking stories, which did quite well. There was a sort of edition for the UK, and then it did well enough so we did an edition for North America and then for sort of Australasia. And I'll try and turn that into a sort of piece of advice by saying that the reason why that was published, I think, was not because it was necessarily a terribly good book, but because it had an original angle. And I think this is all important, really, to get on with travel writing. And I think with any kind of, I also do various other kinds of journalism. And, what is an angle? It's a good question. It's not an easy one to define or answer. If there was an easy formula for it, we'd all be stinking rich writers, and we'd probably all be retired somewhere in the, in Tahiti or somewhere like that. But and I spend a lot of time trying to think about how to explain this to my students who are starting out, and obviously there are students here who are sort of trying to start out in writing. I think you've got to have some kind of original perspective on. It's no good just traveling somewhere and not really having any kind of agenda or plan. You have to, it's very competitive. You have to offer something that is distinctive and different from the crowd, because magazines, publishers are not going to print something that's been done before, basically. As I say, how you do that is very difficult. I think you can look to yourself and your own experiences. Some people have sort of inbuilt angles. There's a colleague of mine and Mike's, a friend of mine and Mike's, called Tony Giles. He's a remarkable guy. It's a guy who's been, I think, blind from birth and been deaf, 80% deaf, I think, since childhood. And he's written now 3 or 4 books. He's had a film made about him. And his unique angle is that he experiences the world in a totally different way to almost everyone else, because he can't see. We're talking about sightseeing and stuff earlier. He can't see anything. So for him, his experience, the way that he relates his travel experiences through touch and through smell. I interviewed him for a magazine that Mike used to edit back in Bristol. And I was just amazed at how do you do this? I was trying to get to the root. Tony was very cool about it. He said, "Oh, well, you just muddle through, I've got my stick and I rely on people." And he hadn't traveled to places that are particularly kitted out to help people with disabilities. He'd been to places like South Sudan. I've been to sub-Saharan Africa as a fairly able-bodied person. I found that difficult enough, let alone if I were in his situation. So for someone like Tony, he's got that. It's I think his first book is Seeing the World My Way, which is sort of ironic title, but it's also very apt because it is, as I say, an utterly unique sort of angle and perspective on writing. So that taught me a lesson about what you needed to do to get published. That then, having done the hitchhiking books, that opened doors into travel journalism. I wrote for everything from sort of airline magazines to, as you mentioned, the Telegraph, New Statesman. I've always been interested in politics and society, and I think for me, travel writing is this beautiful sort of genre that pulls together storytelling and descriptive writing and sort of, literary skills, but it also allows you to be a sort of amateur sociologist, anthropologist, historian. It's a multidisciplinary job, I think, and that's, or at least the way I've tried to approach it. So for me, I've always been interested in politics. That then led me to I went to Ivory Coast in 2015, initially to do some, it's a bit sort of accidental, not unlike the protagonist from Mike's book. I was invited to do a very different job, which didn't sort of, I was going to do some teaching there. That didn't really come off, but I found myself with spare time. So I traveled around Ivory Coast. This is a country that was recovering from 2 back-to-back civil wars. So there hadn't been a lot of Western writing or indeed tourism or travel in Ivory Coast. So again, there was a built-in angle there. I was just maybe crazy enough to go somewhere that other Westerners hadn't been really for a long time. So every story I wrote about various aspects of that culture was attractive to the sort of Western press. This led to this book, which is the Brat Guide to Ivory Coast. I've just finished a second edition of this because it's done quite well. It's done quite well because if you want to go to Ivory Coast, there's no competition. You kind of have to buy this book, so it's sort of like a closed shop, if you like. And then, you know, writing a guidebook is obviously requires a different sort of skill set. You have to be a reviewer. I had to travel when I went back for 3 months with my colleague and friend Alex Sebley, who's a photographer, because I'm hopeless at taking photos. That's another tip for you, is that if you're going to publish travel writing nowadays, certainly journalistically, you're often required to provide photos. And I'm hopeless. I'm the worst photographer who ever drew breath. And I was losing money because you'd get a fee for the words and a fee for the picture, and I'd lose the money for the picture. They'd dig out some stock footage. But that's why I traveled with Alex, who is a professional photographer. He was at a bit of a loose end. So we thought, let's go around Ivory Coast for 3 months. We went to all sorts of places. We went to, we went and saw sort of what they call féticheurs in the kind of French African, which is basically like voodoo rituals, where we saw chickens being sacrificed and things like that. We went into the sort of mountainous areas in the west, which are very beautiful, and you can look across all the countries that border the west of Ivory Coast, like Liberia. That's quite impressive sort of natural scenery. It was very interesting from the point of view of Ivory Coast being an ex-colony of France, but still being very, very much geared towards French culture. So you can walk into the middle of a village in the middle of nowhere in Ivory Coast and find sort of delicious croissants and filet mignon steaks, if you know the right place to go. So it's funny how these sort of post-colonial cultures sort of operate in places like Ivory Coast. So in the meantime, like Mandy, I started a PhD in creative writing with a focus on the Philippines, because in a sort of an earlier period of my life, I did that sort of classic thing of people my generation post Alex Garland's The Beach, where you bum around Southeast Asia partying a lot. And so I got an interest in Southeast Asia and the Philippines from that. That led me to, I'm sort of fast forwarding a bit, to this book, which is called The Realm of the Punisher, which is a sort of political travelogue of the Philippines. It's a travel book, and it's all very experiential, based on my journeys around to as many. It's an archipelago of 7,000 islands, so it's not an easy trip to make, but I got round to a lot of the destinations worth going to. And my agenda, if you like, my perspective was to try to understand the sort of political and social situation there. So I spoke to a trans rights activist. I went to visit a kind of slum area where people were resisting a local real estate company who was trying to bulldoze the slum so they could sell off the land to some other vampiric, evil multinational corporation to build a massive hotel, leaving hundreds of people homeless. I did a bit of investigation into the appalling so-called drug war that's going on there. President Duterte has killed maybe about 30,000 people, not just drug peddlers, but drug users, who are just, you know, killed in the most sort of appalling sort of extrajudicial way. So there was some hairy moments related to that. I interviewed some people who were kind of on a death list, actually a government death list. So I suppose this is where travel writing segued into kind of investigative reporting and sort of political journalism, you could say. Most recently, I've published something that is not strictly travel writing. This is called Imagining Manila. I don't expect anyone to buy this because it's 94 quid. Don't blame me, blame the absurdity of academic publishing. And this is really a sort of academic reflection on a bunch of other Western travel writers who have tried to construct and represent the Philippines from a usually very problematic sort of Orientalist perspective. But then I also write about those writers who have kicked against that and tried to contest that. One thing I'd just say, I was really interested in something that Kevan said in relation to, I think it was when he was talking to Mandy, about the importance of lived experience and reporting on your lived experience. And this, you know, it feels hard to justify this in this world we live in of sort of information overload, where seemingly you can find anything you want on the internet, you know. In the case of Ivory Coast, that simply wasn't the case. You know, there were villages and parts of that country that had never really been written about, certainly in English, and certainly in the West. So Alex and I literally had to go to these places in my not very good French, my terrible French actually. I'd have to try and communicate with like the oldest guy in the village and get him to tell me the history of this village so that we had some information. You know, because this was not, you could not find this in libraries or online or anywhere else. We had to get this fresh and firsthand, you know. So not everything, you may think that everything is available, you know, online. It's not. And so that's one of the important reasons to go out into the world and gather that information firsthand. So yeah, so I'd recommend doing that. Even when there is information out there, there's no substitute. And I go back to what I say about having that personal angle, that personal perspective that's different from other people. You know, if you just read everyone else's secondhand accounts of a place, your response is probably going to be rather derivative and secondhand too. But if you go somewhere and you deliberately tried to do different to what people have done, you know, talk to other people. What I found reading loads of other people's books about Manila and the Philippines was that they had, you know, some guy had come into Manila, spent 3 days, chatted to, you know, usually very privileged, wealthy expats and local members of the sort of bourgeoisie, and then thought, okay, that's my view of Manila, and buggered off home, and you know, jobs are good and the article's done. So I found that there was a sort of limited range of sources, a limited perspective, because people hadn't, you know, bothered to really sort of engage properly and go deep and go into that culture and really try to get a range of different perspectives. So that's one thing you can do if you do travel somewhere. Whether that's, you don't have to go far. I mean, I live in Portsmouth. I find Portsmouth is a fascinating city, contrary to this kind of stereotype that people have about Portsmouth, who Spike Milligan, for example, put it in Room 101 when he was on that program. He said it's one of the worst experiences ever performing in Portsmouth in the music hall or whatever. But I actually think, you know, there's lots, you know, just outside my front door, there's lots of stories waiting to be told. And I'm a strong believer in the local and the importance of the sort of hyper local, as well as the importance of traveling to the other side of the world and getting your stories that way. So I'd recommend everyone, especially in these lockdown circumstances or semi-lockdown circumstances we're in, you know, walk up the road or take a walk, you know, across a field near you and write about that. And I think you'll get some, you know, a lot of mileage out of it, if you excuse the pun. So, anyway.
Brilliant, thank you. With that sense of having that agenda, having that personal approach and that angle, that picking up on some of those words that you use, with travel writing, is it a way? Should you find somewhere that's going to house your story first before you go to a place, or does it work the other way around? Should you go to that place, write the thing, and then try and pitch it to somewhere, like a magazine or an online or you know, publishing house?
That's a really good question. I think when I started out as an amateur traveler, when I bummed around Southeast Asia with, you know, my copy of Alex Garland in my backpack, it's the only time I kept a diary. I traveled for 9 months, 10 months, I think. And you could do it cheaply then. I think the pound is now very weak against these other currencies. So this was pre-2008 crash as well, you know. So I traveled there. I was already writing. I think my hitchhiking book had already come out. I'd done a bit of journalism, but I wasn't writing for a living by that point. So I kept a diary. The only time I've kept a diary, literally, I've still got them packed away in a dusty box behind me. I kept a diary just for my own just for its own sake, really, so that I would remember what happened clearly, more clearly. But that was the first thought. It was really when I got back that I started to think in terms of how I could adapt this material in the diaries to turn into articles, and luckily I could. And some of it became the basis of my. Some of it found its way into Realm of the Punisher as well. But later on in my career, as I started to have some success with writing, get stuff published, I think just for the ease of, I'm naturally quite a disorganized person, I'll be honest with you, but you have to be quite organized. You have to get organized and get disciplined if you're going to write professionally. So since then, really, since I started to make a living out of it, I have usually made some, like I hope to go back to the Philippines next year. I will probably get back to Private Eye, for whom I write a fairly regular piece about what's going on in the Philippines, and just check with them that they're at least remotely interested in me giving them something once I've been to the Philippines. So I think there's no harm in, I think if you're going to be professional about this, then pitch, write a brief proposal. Again, pitching and proposing is an art form in and of itself, and it's really hard to get good at. And another piece of advice for your students, practice that as much as possible. Get good at trying to condense what may be a very complicated angle or thesis or story down to a paragraph or even a sentence, because that's what editors like and need if they're gonna commission you.
Brilliant, thank you. That's going to be really useful. Is there I can't remember, is there a segment on travel writing in the Writers and Artists Yearbook? I think, because that often has information about pitching, doesn't it?
There's some good stuff off the top of my head. I'm looking at that yearbook now. There's some really useful stuff about pitching, I think, longer form non-fiction books and novels, where they give you actual examples of good and bad, and I would recommend reading those, because I think I've probably modeled some of my pitches on them, and I've taught some of that to my students too. So.
Brilliant, cool, thank you. Awesome. Okay, so we've got time for a few more questions. If anyone's got any, I can just see the chat going there. Mike's got a new book out, which is brilliant. Manson's Bristol Miscellany. Yeah, brilliant.
I don't mind doing this for other people, sharing other people's stuff, but I suddenly feel I was always brought up not to show off or be big-headed. If you don't mind, I'm just going to share where people could possibly, if they want to,
please do. Yeah, go for it. And Richard's had a poem published in an anthology about the Australian bushfires, but I spent the time reading and listening to music during lockdown. That's great. Well, congratulations, Richard, on the poem. Brilliant. Any final questions at all? Feel free to put them in the chat or to unmute yourself. Just whilst we're getting up Tom's books there. Brilliant. Thank you.
I'm sorry, I wasn't boasting about that. That was the only thing I did during lockdown, reading music. I only wrote one poem in that time.
That's better than nothing, that's one more poem.
How about a final word of advice for everybody, from all the guests, for future travel writers?
That'd be great. Yeah, top tip or one last word of advice. To put you on the spot there, writers.
Sorry.
I would just say there's a nice quote from I'm going to big up Portsmouth again, if you don't mind, because Neil Gaiman, who's not a travel writer but a very skilled writer in other genres, he said, he has this nice quote about he says something like, as a writer, you can't just hope that you'll spend all day doing nothing, go to bed, and in the middle of the night the fairies will get up and write your story for you, and then in the morning so it's a way of saying you have to put the hours in and work. And I think that isn't talked about enough when you pick up these guides to how to write stuff, or indeed do go to classes, workshops. People think it's almost a bit prosaic or a bit trivial to sort of say, oh well, it's hard work. Let's get on to the interesting stuff and do our exercise and stuff. But actually, it is really hard work, and you've got to put the time in. And it is, I'm not sure if it's quite 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. It's probably a different fraction, but it's a lot of perspiration. And it's a lot of just sitting there agonizing, you know, and rewriting the same sentence over and over. Or at least it is for me. Maybe I'm just a bit dim and I'm not doing it right, and I'll get. But I think for anyone, it's not going to be any good unless it's hard, you know, unless it's hard work, and unless you pursue that process all the way through to, you know, first draft, second draft, third draft. I mean, the first chapter of Realm of the Punisher, I think, went through about 7 or 8 drafts. And I'm not just talking about a draft in the sense of correcting a spelling or a punctuation error here or there. Total rewrites before I was happy with it, before I felt that it set up the rest of the story, because it's so important to begin strong and keep at it and make sure that you just persevere, no matter how sort of difficult and annoying and irritating it gets. That's probably the most important thing I can say.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think it's a slow burn thing, isn't it? And you just got to really work at it and look at the different angles and think kind of outside the box. So when we came to lockdown, I thought, okay, let's just concentrate on what's at hand. And on my walks, I took my camera and, you know, I got a book out of it, which has already been published. And the great thing is, bookshops opening this week, people are really keen to buy books at the moment. So yeah, you know, just think around the problem.
Brilliant, thank you. Amanda or Ben, any final words of advice?
Well, I would say be as brave as you dare to be, and if the tourist advice is don't do this, then find a way of doing it, because that's what's going to give you the original experience. And actually being kind of on the edge and having to be more aware of what's going on around you, because perhaps you're in a slightly dangerous position, is actually going to ramp up your knowledge and also give you a different way of writing about things, I think. So that would be my advice.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, a couple of things. The poet Ezra Pound once suggested that a glance is the enemy of vision, which I take to mean have a good proper look. Don't be timid or self-conscious, whether you're walking down your street or a street in Paris or a beach in Thailand. Be prepared to be looked at. Be prepared to be seen, to be curious. It's okay. It's something to be sort of somewhat proud of. Most people aren't curious, or they don't allow themselves to be so. They are curious. I think everybody is. But permit yourself to have a good and proper look at things. Ask questions, listen, etc. Because then you'll get some of the richness and depth that you'll need for decent writing. And the second thing, when it comes to studying travel writing and creative writing, by all means, learn all the rules, so-called conventions, tropes, habits, tactics, but please, at the end of it all, forget them all. And then just write instinctively. And if that's right, if that writing is sort of rejected or met with indifference at first, don't necessarily pander to those people that are rejecting and meeting it with indifference. Continue to write instinctively and honestly, and eventually, with some effort and some luck, that voice will break through, I believe.
Brilliant, wonderful words to end on there. Thank you, Ben, and thank you to the rest of our panel, Amanda, Tom, and Mike. And thank you to all of our questions, all of our guests who've joined us today. Really great to hear your insights, and we've got some links there to follow up on if we'd like to get hold of your books as well, which is wonderful. Thank you very much, and we hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, James.
Take care.
Thank you, James and Kavan, for inviting us. It's been a really enjoyable event. Thank you to all of you who came along. It's great to see so many students. And I wish I could get these sorts of crowds in some of my online seminars. So yeah, no, it's great. Thank you for that.
Brilliant. And we're going to stay in touch and hopefully one day invite you all onto campus, hopefully in the
That
future.
would be great, and you should come to Portsmouth as well, and we'll do
Wonderful. Yeah.
That'd be nice.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Take care, and do stay in touch.
Thanks,
Bye.
James.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Lee.
you for the opportunity.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Bye.